start. We should be on now. Basically, what we're looking at is the edition's history that you've been running for the past 2 months.
Yes.
And so you have it fixed in your mind. We haven't gone through 4.0. No. We haven't gone through 5.0. But I think you know both of them well enough.
I do.
But in a way, we want to start out with, this is going to be a multi-part blog, too. It might even continue well past the point of just running through these games as examples.
Sure.
But the two things we want to kind of talk about today are what's on the screen there right now, which is Chainmail and Dungeons & Dragons, the original box set cover. I think the Chainmail came before.
Yes, Chainmail was out first.
Yes, but there might have been something that you wanted to begin with.
Sure. Well, this has been a learning experience for me because my own involvement with Dungeons & Dragons started in 1986. The box set predates me by a year. So it wasn't until recently that I even played it rules as written. I've played quite a bit of a retro clone of the early D&D known as Swords and Wizardry. But even Swords and Wizardry refines what appeared in the original box set. So it wasn't until we started this project that I actually seriously delved into the original books to learn how D&D was theoretically played. And I learned quite a bit. And one of the things that I found that was interesting is right off the bat, there are people who have played D&D since the 70s who never used the rules precisely as written. There's a lot of question over whether or not chainmail was regularly used by any of the folks in the Lake Geneva area to do D&D combat, even from the beginning. While the rule books tell you to use chainmail, several forum posts by folks who actually played with Gary Gygax said, well, we never really used that. And they used the alternate combat system, which is in the books, that looks very familiar to what we modern players are used to.
Well, we can kind of parse that on an exact date. They were playing a game called Braunstein. I think this is what I consider trivia. Mm-hmm. But Braunstein is a game that they kind of played with beforehand, before they started playing.
Yes, that was Dave Arneson and Dave Wesley's group that did those games.
They didn't involve chainmail, though.
Well, they involved miniatures wargaming because they grew out of the wargaming campaigns that the two Daves or Davids were playing at the time, and got a little bit bored with the same old moving the soldiers around and shooting and attacking all the time. And so the unsung David Wesley, or Wesley, I never actually heard him pronounce his name. But he came up with the idea of, well, what if we assign people other roles? What if we assign people things that aren't commanders of military formations? And that very first game, which is chronicled in Playing at the World and also in of Dice and Men and a couple of other places, they felt like it was a disaster because there was so many people pulling people off into other rooms and making deals and trying to figure things out. And there were no rules for any of these sorts of interactions. And it seemed to be a mess at first, but then all the players wanted to do it again. And so
this kind of goes against right here in the introduction,
mm-hmm.
Which is one of the key books that we look at. In this introduction here from Peterson's Playing at the World, he mentions, he goes into great depth about Braunstein, but he mentions the second paragraph of the introduction. The earliest account of the history of Dungeons & Dragons also ranks among the briefest. Gary Gygax included it in a letter to Alarums and Excursions in July of 1975, only 16 months after the first sales of the game. And it read as follows. In case you don't know the history of D&D, it all began with the fantasy rules of chainmail.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't using chainmail in Braunstein, which was 1972, 1973?
I believe it was actually, I want to say the late 60s. I would have to look it up.
Well,
Gygax himself was referring to, when he wrote chainmail, he added the fantasy addendum to the rules. a lot of people were playing historical minis at the time, and almost no one was playing what we would recognize as fantasy. That was something that Gygax himself was very interested in and threw in there. And it wasn't well received at the time with a lot of the hardcore historical gamers. They thought it was rather frivolous and not a serious use of the hobby. But I am not certain, as I wasn't there, if chainmail was the actual rule set that the two Davids were using for Braunstein. Or Braunstein.
Arneson provides a 1969 date for Braunstein.
Mm-hmm. Late 60s.
Which is WG number 4. Do you know what WG refers to? It's a periodical. Gamers. Wesley himself has suggested on the Aseum forum and elsewhere that Braunstein might have been first run as early as 1967, but this seems very unlikely in light of the sequence of events. Well, anyway, I think Braunstein really should be considered more trivia. And this statement, in case you don't know the history of D&D, it all began with the fantasy rules of chainmail. We have to take into account Gygax's genius for promotion. The guy was an
There's a lot of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby going on in that statement. But it is true that it wouldn't have happened without the both of them. And there's some other actors that are almost never mentioned. Like, again, David Wesley came up with a lot of the ideas behind Braunstein and then ended up having to leave to go do his military service when he was called up. And on Gygax's side, there was Don Kay, Gary's childhood friend, who was a partner in founding TSR. And the original logo even had the G for Gygax and the K for Don Kay. And he put up some of the initial stake to print the D&D rules. But he suffered a fatal heart attack, sadly, very early on. And so who knows what his contributions would have been later. But Gygax and Arneson are the two that were definitely the movers and shakers that made it all happen.
That's generally understood because of Arneson's. There was that one incident with Arneson.
It was sort of like those old commercials for Reese's where, hey, you got your peanut butter and my chocolate. They had the concepts from Braunstein where you weren't necessarily moving troops around on a map. You could have another job. You could have another role, another place in this game world. And then they went over to Chainmail, which had the man-to-man rules for single-character combat. So for what may have been the first time, your miniature didn't represent a unit of soldiers. It represented one soldier. And so now it mattered what kind of armor you were wearing or what kind of weapon you were wielding. It wasn't just an amalgamation of 30 or 50 or 100 troops. And so you put those rules together with the concepts of exploring dungeons and doing things that aren't maneuvering troops on the open battlefield, and you ended up with D&D.
Well, they used the rules of wargaming, which were not really very codified. Everybody had maybe their own in-house rules.
There were different rule sets that people used. Chainmail was just one of them.
For instance, this suggests to me that they were using miners or sappers because they were underground, and they might have discovered a tunnel, and a sapper crew would be a small crew.
Right.
But that's not necessarily that's anecdotal.
Right.
To the overall, Braunstein was a particular place, a castle.
Right, and it was a particular model castle that they had owned and were using as fantasy terrain. And they did multiple variations on a theme. There was a Western version and a South American Banana Republic version, and there were several different games they ran in that vein. And one of the things that was necessary, because no one had written rule books for any of this stuff yet, but comes out in a lot of the old school role players today, is this idea of rulings, not rules. If you don't have a rule for it, make it up as you go. And a lot of that went on back then, at least, reading the forums, listening to the stories from the people that were there, going to places like North Texas RPG Con, listening to the folks that were part of the original creation of the game. Some of the artists and authors are there every year. I'm trying to absorb through their stories what it was like. And so there was a whole lot of make it up as you go. There was a whole lot of it did feel a little like a war game sometimes, in that they would run what now would be a ridiculously large party size. You know, the numbers of players that we wouldn't think of running in a modern D&D game. And I remember during one of the sessions where I was gaming with Frank Menser, he offhandedly made a comment to one of the newer players who had never played old school D&D before either, and said, well, you know, sometimes we didn't name our characters till they were 3rd level because you just got killed all the time. And, you know, people would end up with, you know, Bob the Fighter, and then Bob Jr., and then Bob's nephew, and then Bob's cousin, and just keep creating more and more and more characters. It was very different from what we play now, but it was you know, laying the groundwork for the common role-playing hobby. The interesting part is it did grow out of wargaming, and if you look at the cover of those very first books, it doesn't say anything about role-playing on them. It says fantastic war games, playable with paper, pencils, and miniatures. So, I mean, it was really thought of as a war game initially because the concept of the role-playing game was so new.
Here it says Dave Arneson took these rules and changed them into a prototype of what is now D&D. When I played in his Blackmoor campaign, I fell in love with the new concept and expanded and changed his 20 or so pages of handwritten rules into about 100 manuscript pages. Dave's group and ours here in Lake Geneva then began eager and enthusiastic playtesting, and the result was the D&D game in January of 1984. And that's quoted from Alarms and Excursions number 2. So what about... Chainmail was released in 1971 with the Wargaming group. Was it mostly Napoleonic Wars?
Well, not Chainmail. Chainmail was medieval, specifically. A lot of people played Napoleonics, but then again, people played American Civil War and several other time periods. Chainmail was specifically for playing medieval games. And so I've recently, you know, acquired a copy and read through the rules, and there's a lot of things in there that are... a little arcane to a modern rule set's eyes, but I'm interested in how they worked in concert with the early D&D game. The man-to-man rules were definitely something that you can see the bones of D&D inside. And you can also see some of the quirks of the early versions of D&D buried in the chainmail rules, or explained by reading the chainmail rules. For instance, you know, one of the things that just jumped out to me as an epiphany, you know, I started playing with the basic D&D red box when I started playing in '86, and of course everyone lamented when you rolled a 1 for hit points, or if you're playing a wizard and you have a D4 for hit points at first level. And there was always the complaint about the low number of hit points. Well, when you look at the way Chainmail did combat resolution, there were no hit points. You were up or you were dead. If someone actually made the attack roll to hit your character, that was it. And so adding the hit point mechanic in the Dungeons & Dragons books, even if all attacks did the same D6, from a two-handed sword to a dagger to what have you, it still gave your character a mathematical chance to survive what would have been a killing blow on a wargame table. That was huge. All of a sudden, these fighter characters could survive a sword blow or two. And that made them truly heroic in comparison to their wargaming counterparts. It also laid the groundwork for some of the rules we look back at now and kind of raise an eyebrow and go, did anybody ever use that? Like the weapons versus armor charts. They appeared in the original D&D set. They appeared in AD&D. And, you know, I know a lot of people that say, we never used that. But that goes all the way back to chainmail. When every weapon does a D6 damage, the differentiation was in how difficult it was to hit someone with that weapon. And the thing that it reminds me most of is Traveller. But Traveller came after D&D. It was only that I personally had not read Chainmail until I was well into my 40s. So now looking at that, I see what it all meant and why it was important. Because if you take a look at the more streamlined versions of basic Dungeons and Dragons that came out to introduce people to the game in the late 70s and early 80s, saying, well, the wizard can only carry a dagger. Well, if every weapon hit does a d6 damage, and everyone's using the same table to hit on at first level, that makes the wizard just as effective as the fighter at first level, doesn't it? But not if you're using chainmail, because that dagger is going to require a much higher roll to hit than the fighter's sword or two-handed sword. So researching this original edition has given me a new set of eyes for the way D&D evolved and worked.
It says here fantasy fiction, and in particular the sword and sorcery subgenre that most informed Gygax. The most salient background to the publication of Chainmail was the monumental success of the mid-1960s American paperback editions of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, a trilogy that had hidden in the relative obscurity of expensive hardbound editions for a decade. Which is not entirely accurate, because by 1962, 1963, they had published these Ballantine books. There was a plagiarized.
The Ace editions?
Yeah, but that was quickly dropped. They were very successful, and then Ballantine picked them up and published. I think they were not first illustrated by Tolkien, or using Tolkien's illustrations in the covers, but only after a couple of years, then the illustrations moved on to Tolkien's covers, and these were very popular in the early '60s, mid '60s. The sudden and enormous popularity of Tolkien triggered reprints and sales of many other fantasy authors, including among them the 1930s pulp master Robert E. Howard, best remembered as the creator of Conan the Cimmerian, a noted barbarian. In the course of explaining its fantasy rules, Chainmail also makes reference to authors Paul Anderson and Michael Moorcock, both of whom had achieved notoriety for fantasy fiction written in the 1950s and 1960s. If all that had been recounted above, here's what Peterson writes, which I think is very provocative, that all that has been recounted above served only to explicate medieval war games, now we can begin to investigate fantastic medieval war games. Chainmail included a fantasy supplement.
Yes, it did. And that was something that a lot of the hardcore war gamers turned their noses up at, but it was something that Gary Gygax was very passionate about. In the biography that was written about Gygax, which was called The Empire of Imagination, it talks about how he was personally less moved by Lord of the Rings and more by Jack Vance and pulp novels, like you're talking about Conan, that sort of thing. And so a lot of that comes through in the way D&D works. It's much less high fantasy in the beginning and more sword and sorcery, right down to the magic system working the way it worked in Vance's Dying Earth books. If you want to get like a little bit more of an insight into exactly which books that Gygax himself felt were important, in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, there is Appendix N, which is a huge list of fantasy literature, most of which was things that he himself put in when he was writing it. One of the things I miss about older role-playing products is, even in the basic D&D books, there was usually, like in the Moldvay 1980 set, there was a bibliography in the back of fantasy books to go read. And there's even a similar bibliography in like Star Frontiers for science fiction. And you'll find Paul Anderson on both those lists.
Well, Gygax frequently used $5 words, and the vocabulary lessons that the 12-year-olds and the 9-year-olds and the 16-year-olds received reading those books were quite significant. So he mentioned Blackmore, but before we go into Blackmore, I want to go into this particular box set,
Sure.
which they call it the wooden box set, not because it was
wood
wooden,
grain box,
but it was a wood grain that it's not really coming through.
It's on the other below.
There is the wood grain you can see around it, and this cover was
a sticker.
The very first picture. It was a sticker that was on the wood box, but it was actually the cover of one of 3 books that were in there. And this is the first book, called
Men in Magic.
Men in Magic. which is
was the
that
first
book. It's
book.
just that it's slightly discolored than the other ones. The second one was called Monsters and Treasures,
Yes.
and the third one was called
Wilderness.
The Underworld and
Underworld and
Wilderness
Wilderness
Adventures.
Adventures.
And these made use of outdoor survival,
Yes.
which was a war game. If you could speak a little bit.
Sure. Outdoor Survival was an Avalon Hill board game about outdoor survival. It had a large map of a wilderness area, and you picked up various skills, which sort of made it a bit of a role-playing game because different characters had different skills, and you attempted to move around the map and survive. The Outdoor Survival map is listed as a piece of equipment in the D&D rulebook as a wilderness map, and it even has little notes on the pools on the map will equate to fortresses, and it tells you how to convert it for use as a fantasy map. And so TSR kind of avoided the need to produce a game map at that early stage by just referring everyone to one of Avalon Hill's products.
Well, I know they eventually came up with a map.
Yes, they did.
Partly because being the fantasy war gamers there were, so why not use the Bronstein? Because Bronstein was a specific castle. That was a 3D castle with figurines.
So
They needed something that was flat, and they also liked the idea of cross-selling, so that they could include something from Avalon Hill. So Avalon Hill was approving of the game because it might help them sell Outdoor Survival.
Well, Outdoor Survival was listed as, a required or suggested item. With the other maps, Dave Arneson was working on his Blackmore campaign. Gary Gygax had created his Greyhawk campaign, and there were also, they weren't on stage yet, but M.A.R. Barker had been working on his Tecumel setting for years, which eventually became a D&D setting. And then Ed Greenwood had been setting stories in his Forgotten Realms since the 60s, and that would eventually become an official D&D setting. But at this time, there were no official campaign maps just yet.
Well, the Blackmore, there's an image in Peterson's book of the original Blackmore map. I can try to get it up there a little closer to the camera. It has a kind of castle and some woods, maybe a little lake, squares for every house, and it was using a hex grid, and it looked like a typical Mott and Bailey kind of setup, where the Bailey was not connected by a bridge, but just a road that connected it. Maybe it went uphill. And that was the first map that they used. Were they using figurines on that map?
Probably not at that scale. The hexes have been used for a long time just to measure distances. That was actually something that...
Here's something that they said about what Arneson was doing. The protagonists of Blackmore turned out to be the players of the Napoleonic simulation campaign themselves, who, in the conceit of the game, played their own persons as if they had fallen into some sort of time warp or portal that brought them to Blackmore. They were Napoleonic figurines that were transported back in time to a fantasy game setting. So this transition from simulations to fantasy, where your simulation requirements are much lower. In fact, back then, I believe all fantasy was looked down as being sort of low-grade pulp and not very accurate because it didn't approximate reality enough. But here's Arneson changing it around to slip in some sci-fi, slip in some fantasy, and just sort of play around with the idea.
He threw in a Star Trek phaser to one of their games. There was a war elephant that looked like it was about to smash one of the enemy armies, and a druid on the opposite side pulled out a little black box and vaporized the elephant. It turned out it was a phaser from Star Trek. And so yes, there was sci-fi elements being thrown into D&D from the beginning.
Well, with Arneson's Temple of the Frog in the first book, Temple of the Frog was in
Temple of the Frog was in the Blackmore supplement.
Was in the Blackmore supplement, but in this first book, there wasn't any suggestion of a setting.
Not really.
Even in the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, there was not much of a suggestion of setting.
Well, what was interesting about that is there's a set of tables in there that tells you that if you are using the map from Outdoor Survival, so one would assume everyone's using the same map from that box. It tells you to randomly roll for the inhabitants of these castles that are represented by the pools on the map, and so everyone's wilderness would be different then. Like, there was no, this one in this hex is going to be Duke Dunderhead and this one over here. So they gave you everybody used this map, but then they gave you random rolls to determine exactly what the contents of the map were. So in that way, everyone's campaign was different. And what's interesting is if you go back and read the Greyhawk supplement and the Blackmore supplement, nowadays, if you opened a supplement with the name of a location on it, you would expect most of the content of that book to be maps and information about the locale on the cover and, a setting. But those books were actually a lot more rules material than they were the settings. You don't find out very much about Greyhawk in the Greyhawk supplement. You don't find out very much about Blackmore in the Blackmore supplement. You do get new character classes. You do get some new spells and some new magic items. The books are even organized with the titles of the first 3 rule books so that you know where the information you're reading fits into the original box set. There's like a Creatures and Treasure section and a Wilderness Adventures section. But you really don't find out that much about the settings. People were making up their own information on that quite a bit.
I have in a search. Here's more from Peterson's book. In a search for the influences on Arneson's dungeon adventures, Conan makes a fruitful starting point. Arneson's remembrance of reading Conan novels in particular is a potentially valuable clue, since for most of the part of the Conan saga is parceled into short stories rather than novels. Only one Conan work by Howard extends to full-length novel, a tale entitled Hour of the Dragon, later published by Gnome under the title Conan the Conqueror, which is what I read it as, which Lancer in turn printed in 1967 with the Frazetta covers, I believe, is the Lancer books, and those were in the libraries when I was a boy, 1974, 1975. Conveniently, the Hour of the Dragon contains a lengthy sequence that transpires in a dungeon, but a lot of Conan stories occur in ruins that could be just as equivalent to dungeons. So Arneson and Gygax contributed on developing more books. But in how long did they stick with these 3 before they got into those next supplements? Do you know about a year?
The supplements came out the following year.
In
1975, both Blackmore and Greyhawk came out.
But they were playing a lot. They were playing a lot for that in that in-between year and sort of jotting down notes and coming up with ideas.
And, every supplement that came out included more tweaks to the rules and more magic items and a few monsters. And, nowadays everybody assumes the Thief has always been part of D&D. That was actually added in a supplement. There were only 3 classes to begin with, but the Thief came out, the Druid, the Paladin. After a while, flipping back and forth between all the books became a little frustrating and unwieldy, and that's when they decided they were going to revise the whole thing. And that's where Advanced Dungeons & Dragons started development, and that's where the very first basic box set started development, attempting to take these rules that were written with wargamers in mind and repackaging it so that the average person could pick it up, read it, and figure out how to play it. So these books continued to be circulated until the late 70s. They were eventually reprinted. A lot of people call them white box now because the later printings, the first 2 printings had the wood grain boxes. And I'm going to double check myself on that to make sure I am not. The third color, the third printing had a wood colored box.
Yeah.
And then they went to the white box in 1977 with the 6th printing.
Yes.
So a lot of people refer to it as white box D&D. But they kept printing that, and it was the collector's edition at that point. So for a while, you could get both the 3 little books in a box and the new blue dragon cover box that was the basic set.
These were basically 8.5 by 11 pages on a mimeograph machine, which you hand turned, and then you folded them in half.
Yes.
And then stapled. Well, you put a staple in the middle.
Saddle stapled is what they.
Saddle stapled. Some called chapbooks. But the covers were of a thicker.
The covers were a thicker stock.
Did they have a grain to the covers?
Yes, there was kind of a grain.
I wonder where they found that paper in Lake Geneva. Well, there was probably some pretty sophisticated papers.
I know that the first 1,000 of these were printed by a company called Graphic Printing, and they were assembled at home. Like if I remember in Peterson's book, they said Don Kay's garage. The Akeem said they did it at Gary's house. But whichever one, they put these things together by hand, stapled them by hand, and put them in the boxes and applied the stickers. And it was a slow burn. The first 1,000 copies took 11 months. Took a while to set out, but then they caught on. And when you mentioned mimeograph, it reminds me. I did an interview with Aaron Alston, who wrote for many role-playing games, and he was also a novelist. He did some of his Doc Shee novels, and he also wrote a lot of Star Wars novels, which was what he was very popular for shortly before his death. But when I was talking to Aaron about his involvement in D&D, he told me that he did not see a legitimate legal copy of D&D for several years because they were hard to get a hold of, but everyone wanted to play. So there were all these mimeographed copies that people were running at colleges, basically unstapling the books and making bootleg copies so that people could play D&D, even when there weren't a lot of copies around. It was huge on college campuses. And, I see a lot of that now with the gaming clubs at campuses in modern days. But then it was a whole new thing, and there weren't all the distractions that we have now with online games and video games and on-demand video. Something like this was groundbreaking. It was something no one else had done.
Well, it started out kind of a low burn for 2-3 years, but then it just boomed really fast. And they had some troubles at TSR because everybody was making a lot of money.
Yes,
they did. And that's always a problem. It's better if you kind of, you have a certain more incremental, it kind of stabilizes the person's personality. So here's an image of the wargaming in Wesley's basement. To kind of close it up, I think we're about half an hour. That's good. And I think we've talked a little bit about it. The sort of monsters that then were generated. These were out of like a medieval bestiary and really Greek myths. They hadn't really invented any monsters at that point.
There were a couple, and there's a cool story about that because as a child, I apparently had some of the same toys Gary Gygax had. There was a set of cheap plastic dinosaurs produced overseas that he got his hands on, and they had some creatures that never really existed, just some weird, random creatures. Those creatures became the Boule, the Rust Monster, and the Owlbear. He had the little miniature figurines, and they made stats for them to be monsters in the game, and they were completely based on these cheap plastic, like army men kind of dinosaurs. And I remember very clearly my uncle and I having this little figure that I later saw in a Monster Manual and went, wow, that's in D&D. I didn't know what that was. It was a Boule. And it was from the same molds, and those molds are still being used here and there.
If you can remember some of those first from the creatures, there were trolls, there were ogres, there were no orcs.
That I believe orcs were in the early books. Goblins were in there. Hobgoblins, bugbears.
Hobgoblins, bugbears, but that was more like a wargaming kind of creature. But once you throw something like a hydra or a dragon, then you're looking at a level of complexity that they hadn't really calculated yet. So they'd have to come up with factors for those monsters, or a harpy that was flying.
There was a separate, and this is where people get. This is where people get, like myself, confused about how exactly chainmail worked with D&D. There's a whole document out there by folks that did some research, and if anyone out there wants to Google it, the title of the document is Using Chainmail to Resolve OD&D Combats. All the fantasy creatures were on a table for fantasy creatures. But then fighting other humans was conducted on a separate table. The two tables were not directly compatible. If you read them the way they seem to indicate things work, a human below the level of 4th level fighter, which was called a hero, they all had titles in those days, a hero could make a valid attack against a hydra or against a Medusa or these other creatures. But anything less than that didn't even have an entry on the table. And so the question becomes, how do you handle that? And these folks who compiled this doc gave a lot of thought to those questions and sort of made up their answers. But those may not necessarily be what was intended. It was never explained explicitly. So for all this time, all these various groups were making up their own interpretations of the chainmail rules.
Well, if you had to say something in closing, well, we don't want to go too far ahead.
Sure.
We want to kind of keep focus on these first few publications and their inspirations. I think people are probably more familiar with Conan the Barbarian than they are with Lord of the Rings at this point. But it's hard. It's hard to really determine where the industry has changed and flowed, and how it's. I know Harry Potter has taken over a lot of the
and
Game of
sadly,
Thrones and so forth,
because of the way libraries tend to weed, a lot of the books you grew up with, some of the books I grew up with, are no longer really on shelves. If they're not checked out in X period of time, they get weeded and sold at the library book sale. So it's a very different collection of fantasy on the shelves now than what was out when D&D was created. And you're right, there was a lot of what I call panel van fantasy, the kind of things that you will see painted on the side of a 70s van.
Well, yeah,
you
might call it that. The effect of Conan upon Arneson probably gave him. I wanted to include a comment about Arneson's sort of whimsical nature. Maybe he was disrespectful of authority in some way. That was very popular back in the 60s and 70s. And so if people were coming in with wargaming, he might have thought, well, what if a Napoleonic character went back in time or went forward in time, got a laser beam, which is not an unusual pulp theme, time travel. So from that sort of whimsical nature of Arneson, you got somebody picking it up and running with it, who was of a very methodical and productive nature, which was Gary Gygax, who was really the busier, promotional. Gygax wrote and codified. He was publishing books. It looks, I think for and modules for pretty steadily for about 4 or 5 years, and it was all good quality stuff. That was Arneson didn't really have that kind of depth.
Right. According to what Peterson wrote, and according to some of the things in Designers and Dragons, it really does paint Dave Arneson as being much more of a creative type and not as good with deadlines. Whereas, Gary was working on the AD&D manuals at the same time he was writing the Against the Giants modules. He was multitasking and putting out all of this content. And so you may be right about that. I was not fortunate enough to meet either of them when they were still with us, so all I have to go by are these histories.
Yeah,
I
met Arneson, I think 2-3 years before he died. There was a long line. There's a bit of hagiography about both these characters. Mm-hmm. And what I found the most interesting was at the creation of the Gen Con, which is a different subject that isn't quite so relevant. Mm-hmm. They had built a convention center because the entire city of Milwaukee started to get filled up. All the hotels are filled up in Milwaukee with all the gamers coming to Gen Con. So they built a brand new convention center just for that occasion. Of course, they used it in other ways. But there was a security guard there that they eventually made a statue of, a highly realistic statue. And wasn't Gary Gygax and it wasn't Dave Arneson. It was just one of the security guards that had started out there working there. Wow. And for some reason they gave him a tribute. But there is now a statue of Gary Gygax in Lake Geneva, is there not?
I believe it's on its way.
Yeah.
That's something that there is a blogger that comes to the con every year in North Texas that keeps a pretty close eye on such things, and so he makes commentary on the Gary Gygax Memorial Fund and where things are at and what's going on. The plan is to have a memorial in Lake Geneva, but I'm not sure that, I don't believe the statue has actually been created yet.
Commissioned or created. Well, so they were selling 2,000 copies, 6,000 copies. Is there a chart that looks over their
let's see,
the publication rate?
I know the first edition or the first printing was 1,000 copies.
Then it reached 6,000 pretty fast. On college campuses, you said it was more.
Another 1,000 there, 2,000 for the third printing.
And the third printing was the box set that had not the wood grain, but the
wood colored is what this says.
Wood colored, yes.
See, nothing. 5,000 copies for the fourth printing.
And that was the white box.
Yes, that's where white box began. I don't see any.
So that's the fourth year?
This is 19. The fourth printing appears to be mid 1975.
All right, so they had 4 printing over 2 years, I believe. Mm-hmm. It didn't really start in 74.
Yeah, the fourth printing is November 1975.
Right. So they went up from 1,000 to 2,000
to 5,000
to 5,000, and the fourth printing was how many?
No, that was 5,000.
So they had about 10,000 copies sold in the first year it was published. And this was all
pretty crazy.
This was all marketed mostly through wargamers and people on campuses. There must have been ads in sci-fi magazines and in fantasy magazines and like Starlog, mm-hmm. Famous Monsters of Filmland.
Well, and remember TSR did
TSR was already publishing some simulations, so they already had an audience.
And they started their own magazine, The Dragon.
Did it start that year, 1975?
No, the original first few issues were titled The Strategic Review. And let me see, I can find a date on that.
I think 1976, 1977, if I remember. But we want specific dates here. So they started publishing The Dragon, which was a supplement that included all kinds of notations and ideas and odd notions. Very much an Arneson kind of thing.
So Dragon number 1...
1975.
Was June 1976.
1976. So it was after the first year that they had sold something like 10,000 copies.
Yeah.
So they started a magazine.
Yeah, so Strategic Review number 1 was spring 1975.
Okay.
So Strategic Review only ran for 7 issues before they rebranded it as Dragon.
Right, and they turned tactical simulations.
Yeah, they went from tactical studies rules to TSR Hobbies.
Right, and TSR Hobbies then published Dungeons and Dragons, mm-hmm. which is the titles on these books here. Dungeons and Dragons. So they came up with dungeons because it was like a lot of sappers and mining, and the dragons was probably because it's the classic creature of fantasy that isn't a wargaming trope.
The urban legend that I believe Peterson reprints in his book is that they were looking through a whole bunch of words, and Dungeons and Dragons sounded alliteratively interesting to one of Gygax's daughters. I'm not sure which one, if it was Elise or Heidi, but one of them said, "Well, why not Dungeons and Dragons? It sounds Dungeons and Dragons," and they went with that. I was actually hoping to ask Ernie about that when I saw him at North Texas Con, but he's not going to be there for health issues.
Okay. Well, let's try to close it up now.
Sure.
We got about maybe a minute.
All right. Well,
so we'll start. Well, just to suggest, maybe you had something in mind.
Well, I was just going to say it was a very interesting learning experience, and it's something that I would not mind delving more into in the future. Like, I don't think running this version of D&D is a one-time thing for me. I may do it again.
Well, that's the plan. We want to run a whole campaign just using the rules for each edition. So we would be running 6. Well, I don't think we need to go 3.0 and 3.5 as 2 different campaign systems.
Right.
So we could run that so it would be 5 different. In fact, I don't think we want to do 4.0 either. So we'd be running 5E, 3E, 2E. And I think 2E and 1E, there really wasn't that much of a difference in the transition.
There's a few, but they can...
2E,
a good DM can mix and match the two.
And 2E had... The spells were pretty much the same, and it had Unearthed Arcana, which was really fun. And then the old school, or old D&D. What does the OD&D actually stand for? Just to close.
It just depends on who you ask.
So it's like
original D&D, or sometimes it's rendered as zero D&D,
right?
Or
as like a
zero edition.
Yeah.
Because when people say first edition, they're of course talking about advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
So this would be sort of the zero edition.
Right.
And that's kind of it. All started here. It branched off in largely in 1980. The 1977 basic box leads you into AD&D, but then the 1980 basic box leads you off a whole nother product line. And that's probably a discussion for a later blog as to why that product line happened.
Well, what we'll talk about next is Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, but I think that it starts to really to feed into the larger gameplay that we all participated in when we were younger. Well, thank you, Jeff Webb. That was wonderful.
Thank you.